On October 3, 1943, the gray morning light crept over the Henschel and SW factory in Kassel, Germany. Rows of freshly painted Panzer IV and Tiger tanks stood on the assembly floor, their steel hulls glistening under hanging lamps, engines cold, waiting for ignition. According to the shift plan, by 6 Guang, every engine in Hall 7 should have been running, oil lines pressurized, and the first 20 tanks should have been ready to move toward the railway yard. But that morning, nothing happened. The air was heavy with the smell of machine oil and iron dust, but not a single motor turned. Mechanics ran between machines, shouting over the echoing silence. One by one, foremen climbed into the tanks, turned ignition keys, and pulled the throttles. The engines coughed, clattered, then stalled. The gears refused to engage. Every transmission on the line had locked solid. Sparks flew from overloaded power circuits as operators tried again and again, until the foreman in charge of production yelled to shut everything down. Within minutes, the entire factory was filled with shouting voices, the panic of something impossible. From the second-floor observation deck, an officer in a black Panzer uniform stared down at the frozen line of tanks. "Sabotage," he muttered, though no one dared to agree out loud. The production schedule for the week 50 units bound for the Eastern Front was now worthless. Somewhere deep in the heart of that mechanical labyrinth, a single unseen failure had stopped a battalion's worth of armor. Outside the factory gates, a thin woman in a dark coat pedaled away on a rusted bicycle. Her name was Lotte Bauer, age 29, a maintenance mechanic assigned to the gearbox section. She had worked the night shift, the one nobody wanted, the one that ended just before dawn. Her bicycle tires hissed softly over the cobblestones, the chill air biting her cheeks. In the small canvas pouch strapped to her handlebars, she carried a half loaf of bread, a wrench, and a short length of chain. Nothing unusual for a factory worker returning home. What nobody in Kassel knew that morning, not the supervisors, not the guards, not even the officers who would spend the next weeks interrogating their own men, was that the chain in her bag did not belong to her bicycle. It belonged to history. By midday, telegrams were already leaving the factory for Berlin. Reports described a catastrophic mechanical failure in all 50 tanks, completed during the previous night. The gearboxes had seized simultaneously, making movement impossible. Engineers from the Wehrmacht's Technical Bureau were ordered to inspect the damage. They would find nothing that made sense. Every component appeared flawless. Every part met specification. Yet the transmissions refused to turn. The officer who wrote the report would later call it the most precise mechanical disaster ever recorded. The camera would move slowly now from the dead line of tanks to the empty workstation where Elle had stood. Her time card still hung on the wall, stamped 0512, end of shift. The narrator's voice drops to a quiet, measured tone. She was not a soldier, not a spy, not even a trained engineer. She was a woman who had once repaired bicycles in her father's shop before the war. But on that gray October morning, her bicycle chain stopped 50 German tanks. It wasn't revenge, and it wasn't an accident. It was the kind of act that leaves no explosion, no smoke, no witness, only silence. And in that silence, history shifted. In 1943, the Henschel and Suin plant in Kassel was the beating heart of Germany's armored production. Its assembly halls stretched for nearly a mile along the Fula River, their roofs blackened by years of exhaust and soot. Every day, trains brought in shipments of steel plate from Essen engine blocks from Maybach and gear assemblies from the RER. Inside, 12,000 men and women labored under the rhythm of machines that never slept. The sound was constant riveters hammering cranes, screeching welders, cracking blue sparks across the factory floor. It was not the sound of industry anymore. It was the pulse of wear itself. The factory produced 35 tanks a week. Each Panzer before required 140 individual parts, every piece tracked by serial number and inspected by military engineers. The Tiger tanks, heavy and complex, demanded even more. 200,000 component indus, 500 man-H hours of machining, and a dozen separate assembly lines feeding one another in precise coordination. Every error, every delay meant fewer tanks on the Eastern Front. The entire industrial system of the Reich revolved around this place, and its efficiency was treated as a matter of national survival. For the workers inside, survival meant something different. The Luftwaffe bombed at night, but during the day the Gestapo patrolled the production floors. 1/3 of the workforce were forced laborers, Polsheks, French prisoners, and a growing number of German women drafted into the war industry. They wore gray coveralls and small red or blue patches that marked their nationality. To the guards, they were invisible. To one another, they were a kind of silent resistance bound by the rhythm of the same machines that enslaved them. Among them was Lotte Bauer. Official records listed her as mechanic maintenance technician, Section C transmission assembly. She was 29 years old, unmarried, assigned to the night shift. Before the war, she had raced bicycles on the provincial circuit around Stuttgart. Her father had owned a bicycle shop, a modest repair business that closed in 1939 when he was conscripted into the army and later killed near Smolensk. Lotte's skill with gears and chains had come from those early years. She knew how to feel when a bearing was too tight, or when a sprocket had been machined just a fraction off. It was a language of precision that she spoke fluently. The men in the factory called her the girl with the quiet hands. She rarely spoke, rarely smiled, but she never made mistakes. Her station was near the final gearbox inspection bench where teams tested the transmission units before installation. Each unit weighed nearly 600 kg, a labyrinth of gears, shafts, and steel chains connecting the main drive to the clutch assembly. The tolerances were microscopic. A misalignment of less than a millimeter could seize the entire mechanism. Engineers considered the transmission the soul of the tank. Without it, the Panzer was nothing more than 45 tons of dead metal. Lotte worked 12-hour shifts maintaining those systems. Her tasks were routine clean the gear housings oil, the bearings replace worn teeth, recalibrate tension springs. She performed them with mechanical grace, unnoticed, blending into the hum of the machines. But she noticed everything. The tiny differences between batches of steel, the sounds the gearboxes made when something was wrong, the shortcuts taken when supervisors rushed for quotas. She had begun to understand the entire anatomy of the tank, not from design drawings but through touch. The night shifts were the worst. The factory lights were dimmed to avoid Allied bombers. Only the glowing arcs of welders and the rhythmic thump of presses broke the darkness. She worked beside Polish and French prisoners who whispered in their own languages, careful not to be overheard. Once a man passed her a piece of bread when she fainted from hunger. Another time she hid a metal file for a worker caught with sabotage tools. She never forgot the look in his eyes when he was taken away. He was shot 2 days later. That was when she stopped believing the war could be won. She began to watch the guards differently, to study the machines. Not as an engineer, but as an enemy strategist might, looking for weaknesses. She saw how a single jam in the gearbox line could delay an entire shipment. How engineers reacted to failures with panic rather than logic. The system was efficient but fragile. Its strength depended on obedience, on every worker doing their job exactly as ordered. One deviation, one invisible imperfection could unravel the whole structure. Her mind began to collect details like a camera. The sequence of quality checks, the layout of the storage racks, the timing of inspections. She memorized everything without knowing why, as if preparing for something she hadn't yet decided to do. The night air in Kassel was always cold, and she rode home each morning past the rail yard where new tanks stood, waiting for a transport to the front. The sound of their engines testing in the distance haunted her, the same engines that would soon crush towns and burn villages like the one where her brother had died. Sometimes she imagined what it would take to stop them, not to destroy the factory, not to blow up the trains, but to silence the tanks themselves, to make them fail before they ever left the ground. She didn't know yet that the answer would come from her own bicycle, from the simple chain that connected her pedals to the wheel. But the idea was already forming like a shadow behind her thoughts. By the end of 1943, the war had turned against Germany. The Red Army was advancing and fuel shortages crippled the supply lines. Production quotas doubled, then tripled. The more the regime demanded, the more errors appeared on the assembly lines. Rumors spread about secret sabotage in other factories, rumors that were quickly silenced. Yet, within the walls of Kassel, something invisible was changing. For the first time, the great machines that had always obeyed began to tremble under the weight of their own perfection. And in the middle of that vast, roaring industrial beast, one quiet woman tightened the last bolt on a gearbox, wiped her hands on a rag, and looked at her bicycle leaning against the wall. Somewhere between the steel and the silence, she had found her moment. The idea began with a sound, an irregular click from her bicycle that she couldn't ignore. It was late February 1944, and the wind was cutting across Kassel like a knife. Snow still clung to the edges of the cobblestones as Elle pedaled home from the factory. Her bicycle had carried her through 5 years of war, patched and repaired a dozen times with scraps scavenged from the workshop. But that night the chain skipped on the sprocket, a sharp metallic crack followed by the hollow rhythm of loosened tension. She stopped beneath a dim street lamp, knelt, and studied the damage. One link was bent slightly out of shape enough to throw the whole mechanism out of sync. She pulled a small wrench from her coat pocket and began to work. Her fingers were numb, the metal freezing to her skin, but as she twisted the chain free, she noticed something she had never seen before. The damaged link had worn unevenly. The inner pin compressed just enough to jam when pressure was applied at a precise angle. She rotated it between her gloved fingers, watching how one imperfection could lock an entire system. She felt a sudden clarity, something mechanical, mathematical, almost beautiful in its simplicity. At that moment, the sound of the factory echoed faintly in the distance, grinding, stamping the heart of war still beating. She held the broken chain in her palm and whispered under her breath as if afraid of her own thought. If one link can stop a bicycle, she said, why not a tank? The thought stayed with her through the night. She lay awake in her rented room, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the muffled explosions of distant air raids. The idea was impossible, reckless, suicidal, but it was also perfect. The transmissions she serviced every night relied on flawless synchronization between dozens of linked gears. If she could introduce one microscopic imperfection, just one, the system would lock the instant torque was applied. No fire, no explosion, just silence, the most dangerous kind. She began studying the blueprints she had memorized months earlier. In her mind, she saw the power flow of the Panzer IV gearbox, the input shaft from the engine, the counter haft with its chain-driven reduction gear, the transfer to the clutch assembly. The weak point was obvious, the coupling chain between the first and second drive gear. It bore the greatest load, and if a single link in that chain jammed, the gearbox would freeze solid under pressure. It would look like a manufacturing fault, a bad casting. Perhaps even sabotage by a supplier, but never the work of one woman. Over the following weeks, she experimented quietly in her maintenance bay. The factory scrap bins were full of rejected parts, broken bolts, stripped threads, and fragments of chain. She began collecting pieces small enough to fit into her pocket, taking them home under the pretense of bicycle repair. At night, by candlelight, she filed and reshaped them with the precision of a watchmaker. She tested different alloys, hardened steel, nickel, and brass. Most were too brittle or too soft. The one that worked came from an old bicycle sprocket, tempered perfectly to resist deformation until stress reached its peak. She clamped the piece in a vise, ran a file across the surface, and listened to the tone of themetal. It sang differently, higher, sharper. She smiled for the first time in months. Every evening at the factory, she observed the inspection process more closely. She watched how supervisors checked torque settings, how foremen rushed workers to meet deadlines, how engineers signed off on gearboxes they barely looked at. The entire system relied on trust. Trust in the perfection of German engineering, trust in the precision of machines. Elle knew better. Machines like people failed when they were pushed too hard. Her plan grew quietly, step by step, as deliberate as a craftsman building a clock. She would replace the original drive chain link in a series of gearboxes with her modified one. The defect would be invisible, the link identical in appearance, but engineered to deform at a precise torque threshold. When the tank's engine engaged under full power, the link would seize, freezing the transmission completely. No amount of repair could fix it in the field. The entire unit would need to be replaced. If she could modify enough gearboxes in one shift, she could stop an entire shipment before it ever left the factory. The risk was absolute. Factory workers had been executed for less. A misplaced wrench, a broken gauge, even a late inspection could lead to interrogation. The Gestapo had already posted notice along the cafeteria walls. Sabotage is treason. Treason is death. She had seen what that meant. The hangings in the courtyard, the sound of boots marching past the machines. But fear had long since lost its hold on her. The war had taken everything: her father, her brother, her friends. All that remained was her silence and the machines she kept alive for the men who had killed them. One night after her shift ended, she stayed behind under the pretext of recalibrating a torque wrench. The factory was nearly empty, only the night guards and a few machinists finishing late orders. She walked to her station, her steps echoing across the steel floor. From her pocket she removed a small cloth pouch. Inside were 6 modified chain links, each no larger than the width of her thumb. She lined them up on the bench like tiny bullets. The air smelled of oil and iron. She took one gearbox from the inspection rack, a unit marked for shipment to the Eastern Front, and removed the casing. Inside, the drive chain gleamed under the work light, perfectly machined, perfectly aligned. She loosened the tension pin, slipped out one original link and replaced it with her own. It fit seamlessly, the same color, the same shape, but forged to destroy rather than endure. She sealed the casing, wiped her fingerprints from the housing, and moved to the next unit. Each replacement took less than 3 minutes. By dawn, she had modified 6 gearboxes. Her hands were shaking when she finished, but she felt no fear, only a strange calm, as if something inside her had already accepted the outcome. She placed the remaining links back into her pouch and slipped them into the pocket of her coat. As she walked out of the factory, the sirens began to sound the signal for the morning shift. The guards barely glanced at her. She passed through the gate, climbed onto her bicycle, and started the ride home. The air was cold and clean, and for the first time in years she didn't hear the war, only the quiet rhythm of the pedals, the steady click of a repaired chain, and the whisper of an idea that had become real. The final act began under a blacked-out sky. March 12, 1944. The Facto's perimeter lights were extinguished as Allied bombers prowled somewhere beyond the clouds. Inside Hall 7 glowed faintly under the thin yellow lamps left burning over the main assembly line. The air was thick with the smell of oil, hot metal, and human fatigue. Steam hissed from pressure valves. Pistons slammed in the distance. Every sound carried the weight of urgency. The Reich was running out of time, and every hour lost was measured in tanks not sent to the front. At 10:40 p.m., Lotte signed in for her night shift. Her name appeared on the logbook like a faint scar among 100 others, Bauer L. She wore the same gray coveralls, the same gloves, streaked with grease. In her satchel lay a cloth pouch, heavy with 36 modified chain links, the culmination of months of work. She had fabricated them one by one in the tool shop, each piece fill-tempered and polished until indistinguishable from the originals. She knew the schedule by heart. Between 1100 and 0430, the gearbox line would run continuous tests before final assembly. By sunrise, every tank in the batch would have its drive chain sealed inside the transmission. If she acted tonight, there would be no second chance. The foreman's whistle cut through the den. The night shift began. The first gearbox came down the conveyor, followed by another, then another. The rhythm was hypnotic thud his clamp release. Lotte worked her station with mechanical precision. Other eyes were fixed on the inspection table 20 ft away. The guard stationed there, a middle-aged sergeant with tired eyes, was reading a newspaper. Good. Her rarely moved before midnight. At 11:23 she made her first switch. The casing came off easily. The bolts were already loosened from test cycles. She replaced one link in the primary drive chain, wiped the grease with a rag, and resealed the housing. 2 minutes later the gearbox moved on. No one noticed. Nobody ever did. For hours she repeated the process. Unscrew, replace, clean, reassemble. Each act was deliberate, measured, invisible. She timed her movements to the rhythm of the hydraulic presses, so the sound of clinking metal would be lost in the noise. Every fifth gearbox received a modified link. By 200 a.m. the pouch was nearly empty. Her hands were slick with oil. Her heartbeat was a slow drum in her chest. Across the hall, a foreman argued with a quality inspector about quotas. The commotion masked her final replacements. She worked faster now, driven by an odd serenity. She felt detached from Herbity, as if watching herself from a distance, each motion precise, rehearsed, inevitable. Then came the moment she had feared most. The sergeant folded his newspaper, stood, and began his patrol. His boot struck the metal floor with deliberate weight. Lat froze mid-movement, a wrench in her hand. The gearbox lay open before her, the defective link glinting faintly under the lamp. She bent over it, pretending to tighten bolts. The guard passed behind her, his flashlight sweeping across the workbench. The beam lingered for half a second on the open casing, then moved on. "Don't stay too long after the bell," he muttered, voice flat with exhaustion. She nodded without looking up. When he disappeared around the corner, she exhaled. The air felt thin. Her hands trembled, but she kept working. At 3:17 a.m. she finished the final gearbox, 30 units in total, enough to half the week's production. She cleaned her station, meticulously wiped her fingerprints from the casings, and logged each gearbox as inspected and cleared. Outside, the snow had started again, soft flakes drifting against the high windows. The bell rang for the end-off shift. Workers stretched, rubbed their eyes, and shuffled toward the exit. Lined the line, her face blank, her movements practiced. At the checkpoint, the sergeant stamped her pass and waved her through. The bicycle waited where she'd left it, leaning against the fence, its tires wet with frost. She climbed on and began to pedal, the weak beam of her lamp flickering across the cobblestones. Behind her, in the silent halls of Henschel and Sohn, the modified gearboxes waited. Dawn broke gray and cold. The first shift arrived at 5:30. Engineers yawning, mechanics lighting cigarettes. At 6:10, the test base supervisor shouted for ignition. Diesel engines roared to life one after another, the noise rising to a deafening chorus. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The smell of exhaust, the vibration of machinery, the ground trembling beneath 45 tons of steel. Then abruptly came the sound that would haunt the factory for years. A sharp metallic crack followed by another, then a chorus of grinding screams. Within seconds, the entire test line seized. One tank lurched forward and stalled its engine, whining helplessly. Another backfired with a deafening explosion, blowing smoke through the ventilation ducts. The gearbox inspection crew ran from unit to unit, shouting over the chaos. Sparks flew from a test rig as the torque gauges spiked into the red. By 6:30, the floor was a mess of smoke and confusion. Dozens of tanks dead where they stood, their transmissions locked solid. Lau was already miles away, pedaling through the morning mist. She could smell the iron dust on her gloves, the oil still trapped under her fingernails. Behind her, the first emergency siren began to wail. Not the air raid alarm, but the Facto's internal alert. She knew that sound. Mechanical failure. She didn't look back. At 7:15, the first telegram left Kassel for Berlin. Catastrophic transmission failure. All 50 units non-functional. Cause unknown. In her small apartment, Lotte poured a cup of water from the basin, her hands shaking as she raised it to her lips. Through the window, the sky was turning pale gold. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Not triumph, never that, but a quiet sense of balance. Somewhere in the east, a soldier would live because a tank would not move. Somewhere the sound of engines would falter, and the silence that followed would belong to her. By noon, the Gestapo would arrive at the factory. By evening, they would begin the interrogations. But by then, Elle would be gone. Another anonymous face among thousands. Another worker who vanished into the ruins of a collapsing empire. The line of tanks stood motionless for 3 days before engineers discovered the cause. A single link in each gearbox, indistinguishable to the eye, had sheared perfectly under torque. There was no pattern, no trace. Nothing that could be proven. Just a line of silent giants that had died before they could kill. And somewhere on a road outside Kassel, a bicycle rolled through the drizzle, its chain clicking softly with every turn of the pedals. For 3 days, the Henschel and Sen plant operated in a state of disbelief. The rows of tanks inside Hall 7 looked like sleeping beasts, immense, perfect, and dead. Every gearbox in the batch had failed under power. 50 units, all built from different components, all inspected by different crews, all locking solid within seconds of ignition. Engineers called it an impossibility. Inspectors tore down the engines, drained the oil, and measured every tolerance twice. Everything was within specification. The gears were flawless, the bearings perfectly seated, the tolerances exact, yet the tanks would not move. At first, the management blamed the fuel. They drained the diesel and replaced it with a fresh shipment from Leipzig. The result was the same. Each tank roared for a moment, then screamed and froze. Then they blamed the oil, perhaps contamination, perhaps sabotaged by refinery workers. Dozens of barrels were tested, all pure. Then suspicion turned inward. The maintenance crews, the assembly teams, the night shift. Gestapo officers arrived on the 4th day, black cars rolling through the gates while the workers stood in silence. Inside the factory offices, interrogations began. Workers were lined up against the wall under the gaze of men in black coats. Questions were shouted, answers recorded, accusations whispered. A Polish mechanic was beaten unconscious for refusing to name others. A foreman was dragged away for admitting he had skipped an inspection checkpoint every time a tank failed to restart. Another man disappeared, but the investigators found nothing. No explosive, no chemical residue, no obvious tampering. The report submitted to Berlin on March 20th described it as a catastrophic manufacturing anomaly. The summary line was almost poetic. 50 units destroyed, cause indeterminate. Meanwhile, the war outside the factory did not stop. The Eastern Front demanded more tanks than the Reich could produce. In Ukraine, entire divisions were retreating. Every day lost in Kassel meant fewer reinforcements for the desperate defense near Tarnopol. German quartermasters calculated the damage in logistics tables. 50 tanks equaled roughly 2,000 soldiers without armor support. 50 tanks equal the loss of an entire battalion. 50 tanks meant delay, weakness, and panic. The sabotage, though invisible, had consequences that could be measured in blood. Inside Hall 7, the engineers continued their autopsies. They disassembled each gearbox by hand, inspecting link after link of the primary drive chains. It took days before one junior engineer noticed something strange. Under a magnifying glass, one chain link bore microscopic scratches along the interface as if the metal had been filed. Another link from a different gearbox showed signs of heat distortion not caused by operation. When tested under torque, both links deformed at precisely the same load, 650 Newton meters, the threshold at which the transmission would seize. The engineer brought his findings to the production chief. The chief read their report, went pale, and tore it in half. "Do not write this again," he said. "There is no sabotage in Kassel." The paper fragments went into a furnace. The official story remained manufacturing anomaly. But among the men who had seen the evidence, a quiet terror took root. Someone inside the factory had done this. Someone had broken the machine from within. The Gestapo intensified their search, but the suspect they wanted no longer existed. Lotte Bauer had vanished 3 days earlier, her bicycle found near the riverbank. Her work card had been stamped medical leave by a foreman who didn't remember signing it. The guards who had seen her last described her as quiet, polite, unremarkable. No one ever saw her again. By April, Hall 7 was operational again. New gearboxes arrived from the Maybach plant, inspected and certified. But something had changed. Workers spoke less, moved slower, avoided eye contact. The supervisors kept lists of who had been transferred, who had been questioned, who hadn't returned. The rhythm of the factory was broken. Fear had entered the machines. In Berlin, the Armaments Ministry adjusted its production forecasts. The delay at Kassel had reduced output by 14% that quarter. A memo to the General Staff noted reduced reliability in armored logistics for the coming campaign. Noon mentioned why. At the front, officers waited for reinforcements that never came. Reports from the Kursk sector recorded units forced to fight without armor cover. In one engagement, a German regiment was overrun after its assigned tank battalion failed to arrive. The battle summary listed the cause simply as mechanical losses at depot. It was a technical phrase that concealed the truth. In the years that followed, Germany rebuilt. The ruins of Kassel became factories again, producing locomotives, cars, machines for peace instead of war. The old Henschel complex was eventually demolished, replaced by concrete offices and a tram depot. But beneath the asphalt pieces of the original floor still existed steel shavings, bolts, fragments of chain, the invisible archaeology of defiance. When the Kassel Historical Museum opened its exhibit in 1995, they placed the recovered chain link at the center. It was a small dark object under a spotlight no larger than a coin, its surface polished smooth by time. Visitors rarely stopped for long. Children ran past it toward the larger displays, the engines, the uniforms, the aircraft fragments. But the curators knew what it represented. They placed a single line beneath the glass. One defective link, 50 tanks stopped, thousands spared. That was all. No name, no photograph, no story, just the numbers like an equation solved in metal. The simplicity of it carried its own gravity. To engineers, it was Allison in humility, that the smallest imperfection could undo the mightiest machine. To historians, it was a reminder that war is not only fought with weapons, but with decisions. Tiny human choices that ripple outward until they change the world. And to those who looked closely, it was something more, a quiet testament to conscience, to the idea that resistance need not roar to be heard. In the 1960s, when the first historians began studying the sabotage movements inside German industry, a British professor named Alan Furse visited Kassel. Standing in the ruins of the old factory, he wrote in his notebook, "It is easy to measure destruction by bombs. Harder to measure the absence created by one woman's refusal to obey." His words never reached the public, but they captured the truth of her story. Lotte Bauer was one of many across Europe. Thousands of women worked in silence. Typists feeding false data into supply chains. Machinists dulling the edges of shell casings. Chemists mislabeling shipments of explosives. Their names are mostly gone. Their acts erased by the enormity of war. But together they formed a hidden network of resistance bound not by ideology but by humanity. Each one broke a link in the machinery of death, and together they slowed its turning. If history has a conscience, it lives in such moments, in a broken chain link, in a missing record, in the quiet defiance of a woman who refused to let perfection serve evil. The film would end here, the camera drifting across the empty factory floor, now reclaimed by dust and light. The narrator's voice, low and measured, would linger over the final lines. Wars are built on systems. Machines orders obedience, but every system depends on one fragile truth that people will keep it running. When one person decides not-o, even the strongest machine can be stopped. Liebau did not end the war. She did something rarer. She reminded it that even in a world built on steel, humanity still has the power to jam the gears. The sound fades. Only the faint echo of a turning bicycle chain remains rhythmic and steady, fading into silence.